Good evening and welcome to The Right Side, the show where we talk about today's news, views, trends, and opinions from an admittedly conservative perspective. I'm your host, Chris Pareja, and this evening we're joined by Tom Del Beccaro. He's former chairman of the California Republican Party, author of the new book, The Divided Era, as well as a candidate for U.S. Senate against Barbara Boxer. Tom, thanks for coming.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So you've got quite a history in politics, but talk to us a little bit how it all got started.
Well, my family's been in politics since the 50s. My parents came out of Chicago, then they moved around the country, wound up in New York in the late 60s. My father helped start the Conservative Party of New York with a handful of people. James Buckley, they elected him, the only Conservative Party member ever to get elected to the U.S. Senate. He stayed involved. We moved out here during the 70s. He would work in Republican politics out here, walk precincts. We would be a part of that process. He was actually also on the UN World Food Council, testified before Congress, gave his opinions when asked about subjects to Congress and presidents alike. And so politics has pretty much always been in our blood, and I've been a volunteer in politics for a long time now, about 15 years.
So what you're saying is your family went to Chicago, New York, and California and got involved in conservative politics.
Yeah, absolutely. Now that you say it that way, I don't think I've ever thought about it that way. So we've always been willing to stand up against the trend, I guess.
And the machine, and he passed on a death wish to you because you're still in that same fight.
Well, look, I think certain ideas are worth fighting for. That may sound a little bit trite, but the reality is we need to bring some solutions to this state. We need to bring them to Washington, D.C. They're out there. You just got to focus on them, build the right coalition.
Right, and the reality is that when we talk to people as humans, and we do see ourselves as very divided right now as a country, and we'll talk about that, hence the name of the book, The Divided Era, right? But when we talk about all the stuff we're not supposed to talk about, it seems that there is a lot more in common than divides us, at least in my perspective. Do you find similar?
Well, I think the political cultural divisions are growing in America. We were much more homogenous our first 200 years than we are now, really our first 160 years than we are now. But nevertheless, Americans still think a lot alike in some important areas. And you bring up an important point, and I talk about it in the book, this notion of whether we're actually talking to our neighbors or not. Because once the division starts, if all you do is lob bombs across the street or across the hallway or across the aisle in Congress, you don't get much done. That's in part human nature. When I wrote this book, I didn't see to point fingers at one side or the other. But you are right that if you can break that down and talk, sometimes you can build bridges.
And so do you see a difference, though, between the parties in power, and some would argue that that's actually becoming more and more of a one-party system as opposed to having a separation when you look at the leadership at the top, and the rank-and-file voter? Do you think that there are differences there? Or do we as voters just adopt whatever the bad behavior is of our elected leaders?
Well, I'm not sure it's one particularly or the other. If you look at human history, usually events drive things more than particular individuals. So if you look at Harry Reid passing out of the Senate, you see the Senate now actually functioning again. Here was an individual who was able to gum up the works, but tomorrow an event could occur and you could get great cooperation. Take 9/11 for an instance. Remember, when Bush 43 gets elected, you go through the constitutional crisis, there's great division, and then an event occurs and the country's brought back together for a period of time under some good leadership with Giuliani and Bush at the time. So the other dynamic is the size of government. The larger government gets, the more divided the civilization. That's always been true. We're functioning in that, or dysfunctioning in that dynamic right now. The question is whether certain leaders, and this is what I talk about in the book, can bridge that gap.
Right. And is that because as the government gets increasingly large, what occurs is there's more of a battle for power than there is for actually doing the work of the people?
Yes, the work of the people has always been a nebulous understanding throughout all of history. You know, democracy is a hectic interlude in world history. We've mainly been governed by centralized governments, from kings to dictators, from Putin to King George for us. But so the work of the people usually doesn't come out in the wash. It's usually about those in power. What our founders thought about and knew was this dynamic that if you gave too much centralized power, those people would care about themselves and not the freedoms of people. And as government grows, the more it grows, you're 100% right. What you'll find is that division grows because the competition to control grows as well. I mean, we spent $100 million plus in Iowa in 2014 for a Senate seat. 2 years before that, the average Senate seat victory, they spent $10 million. That was the average spent to win the seat. We spent over $100 million in Iowa. The candidates alone in Georgia spent $68 million, and then they spent in the 90s overall. Now, these are small states. North Carolina, another close to $100 million. Why? Because winning the Senate was that important, because winning the Senate meant controlling this behemoth of a government. So the larger government gets, the more the competition to control it, the more spoils it can dole out, and the more differences of a people.
Right. And so you bring up the founders, but didn't they all just get along? I mean, they gave birth to a country together and everything else. Or are we much more divided now? Was there division then? Talk to us. Okay,
so this is why I wrote the book called The Divided Era, referencing this particular era. And the book's a work of historical philosophy, and what that is comparative history is a way to look at it. I take different eras in time, and I relate them. I take our three most divided periods and our two most unified. I draw parallels from today to the divided periods, and then look forward with the two unified. So real quick, the divided periods, the three most divided in my view, were about the 1760s, right before we come to this notion that we're going to fight a revolution, up until the day the Constitution is adopted. The next most divided would be Lincoln's election, when the South secedes, that to the end of Reconstruction, which is a very divisive period. That ends in the 1870s. It's overlapped by the next divided period, which is the Gilded Age. So are we more divided today than in the past? Didn't the founders get along? Actually, not at all. The votes and the intensity and the disagreements that the founders went through to create the Constitution and to go fight the revolution even before that are stunning. Here's a stat which a lot of people don't know, but it boils it down. In South Carolina, during the Civil War, there were 103 battles where no Redcoats and no Continental Army were involved. These are just South Carolinians on one side or the other. It is referred to for many at the time, and a lot of historians, as the First Civil War. It was a bloodbath. It was 8 years of incredible disagreements. It took forever to build a consensus even to do it. Then once it started, it still was difficult to prosecute. There never was national consensus that there should be a revolution. And even after the victory, a lot of people that were sided with the British left. One of the reasons why we calmed down isn't because the vanquished decided to be good Americans, but a good deal of them actually left the country. So division, and division's natural. The point of the book is for people to understand how natural division is. Imagine deciding to fight England, the preeminent superpower in the world. How do you convince an everyday person, by the way, you're going to risk your entire life? How does Washington choose to commit treason? How does Sam Adams write with his quill that we should do these things? You're asking people to make a momentous decision. This is a life or death decision they're facing. So it took a lot to convince them to do it, and there was disagreements all the way. When the Constitution came out, it was even worse in some respects because they just fought a war. They had the Articles. The Articles had a way to amend them, And what happened? They junked the articles. These founders, these icons of history, weren't following the law. They called themselves Federalists, Chris. They weren't Federalists. Federalists, they were consolidating government. It was actually the Anti-Federalists who were misnamed in a great marketing move by our founders. And there's a newspaper headline or an article written about it. The country's alive with wrath when the Constitution is first shown to people, because they feel like we just did all of this, we got our freedom, and now these people are taking it away and putting it in a centralized government. These people committing the treason were, of course, our founders.
Right. So talk to us about the United Times.
The two most, in my view, United Times were when Washington, his first 6 years, and James Monroe ran for president in the era of good feelings, and he ran unopposed.
You didn't mention Obama bringing us together. That's interesting to me, but go ahead.
That would be the hallmark of our divided era, the last two presidencies. Imagine, though, a president running unopposed. This is James Monroe running for his second term, the same year that there's a compromise over slavery and the same year that there's a banking run panic. But people didn't go to government for every little thing, and they thought he was doing such a good job that he ran basically unopposed. Washington was a leader, to me, the greatest leader of all time, because he made the United States real. Remember, when he takes over the presidency, there's nothing. There's 4 pieces of paper. That's how long the Constitution was, 4 pages. There's no Bill of Rights. There's no cabinet. There's no drugstore to go down and get the directions on how to create any of this. Everything he does is precedent.
And no IRS, no Board of Education, none of that stuff either.
No EPA,
No.
Nothing. So everything he does takes precedent. And so what the book does, the Divided Era does, is it explains the utter turmoil it took to get to his inauguration, how divided we were all along. And then this amazing leader, this person with an incredible vision of a United States, because never in history have states voluntarily gotten together in a compact, based it on a vote, based it on mutual respect for certain laws. This has never occurred. He makes it real. And his force of vision, he was, depending on the historian you point to, Paul Johnson, the British historian, has written a lot, says that he's the preeminent person who comes up with this idea, the first real American to say there should be these United States. And through just his character, his vision, his resolve, he forges everyone together. By the way, one thing I do in the book is debunk this notion that he was a nonpartisan. It's just simply false. He did warn us of factions. But remember, for Washington, he takes office, he brings the factions that were already existed into his cabinet, Hamilton on the one side, Jefferson. But he was for the United States Party. And he knew if there was any fighting outside his parameters, the place never would have taken off. So you had to be on the United States Party with him. When he was asked what kind of vice president he wanted, he said, well, anyone as long as he's a good Federalist. So he was not nonpartisan, but as I talk about in the book and try and debunk this notion that he was against parties, really what he was for was the United States. And you were going to be on George Washington's team. And he was such a colossus that people were willing to do that. Just to give you a sense of what a stunning leader he was, the next 5 presidents worked for him. You can't even imagine that notion today.
Right.
That the next 5, at one point or another, supported an existing president. It's just an amazing achievement. And for James Monroe, I call the era of good feelings is the very opposite of today, right? No one talks about good feelings, barely at all. He actually did very little. He had Congress do very little. He opened up More of the countries, additional states came into being, additional territories. People moved west to get away in some respects. And he didn't legislate us into differences. Every time a piece of legislation occurs, there's a winner and a loser, and often someone to pay for it. Well, in his inaugural address, he talked about preserving rights. It can fairly be said that we didn't take away rights. Imagine that today. Both he and Jefferson bragged about the fact that they were paying down the debt. Jefferson bragged about laying off tax gatherers. Imagine how good would that be? Which is why we need a flat tax today to lay off a few IRS tax gatherers.
All right. So talk to us about today's climate. You alluded to the fact that we're again in a divided time. What makes you say that?
Well, the level of competition is probably the biggest earmark of why we're in such a divided period. In those prior divided periods, and I talk about this in my book, The Divided Era, I talk about the intensity and how the competition actually occurred, right? So, for instance, the Federalists at the time of the adoption of the Constitution did their level best so that anti-Federalists could not get into the newspapers. Does that sound fair? Remember, these are our icons, right? During the Gilded Age, this is called the golden age of the two-party system, the competition was incredibly intense, right? During the Gilded Age, if you became president in 1872 or whatever year it was, you had the right to fire every federal employee because there was no Pendleton Act. They were all political appointments. So to win meant to really win, and you could give out incredible spoils, right? In fact, that's where the spoil system comes from, the notion of winning those elections. Now, all of that receded with the end of the Gilded Age. The Pendleton Act came in, and there were now, you couldn't have these there were certain political appointments, but you couldn't fire everyone. They became civil service. And in other ways, we can talk about the party's power diminished. And government did less the first 50 years of the 1900s. It just did less. Did a lot more, and it was a lot more intense between 1860 and the end. Now, however, governments are doing really a mind-boggling amount. So between the local governments and the federal government, they're spending over $6 trillion a year. And more than half of Americans receive a check either directly or indirectly from government. And you have a president capable of favoring Solyndra over coal. So such enormous power, and it's human nature. And I don't blame either party per se. I mean, they both participated in this growth of government. But it's just human nature, if all this power is out there, to go for it. Right. And so a lot of our division today is over trying to control these spoils. That's number one. Number two, the competition to get those spoils. So to control giving them out and then to get them. And that's why the party intensity is occurring right now.
And the special interest intensity, because they're driving that, and they buy both sides anyway. But
so it's good you brought up special interests, because now we've reached another different dynamic. Because government is so large today, it is both a feeling of voters and certain groups that they can't influence government as a whole like they would like to. So they become special interests in the sense that they say, well, my vote won't change the whole government. By the way, that's one of the reasons why we have a lower voting rate today than 100 years ago, because people don't feel that they can have government turn on a dime if they vote like they did in the second half of the 1800s. Special interests, the notion comes up, well, if I can't control the whole government, I can save my guns. Mm-hmm. Or if you're a part of the abortion argument, you can join one side or the other because you think on a particular issue you could have enormous influence. So again, the larger government gets, the more special interests you're going to get. Because if a government that has 100 things will find people who care about 100 issues, a government that does 6 trillion governments will find people trying to influence each and everything they do.
Right. So we have a few minutes left. You're running for Senate.
U.S. Senate, yes.
For U.S. Senate, Barbara Boxer's seat. Talk to me about what a candidate needs to do to either leverage the divided era or bring an end to it, to the degree they can as an individual.
Well, I think the most important thing a candidate needs to do is to present some unifying vision on some particular issue. I refer to this as foot in the door politics, which is like what occurred with the contract with America. That was not an effort by the Republicans to say, I'm going to cure every aspect of government. But if you let me in, I'm going to do these things. And people responded to it. So as a candidate myself, I think there should be 1 or 2 issues, important issues, that we present actual solutions, not just pointing fingers, not blaming one side or the other, picking a few solutions, ideas that cross all demographics and party lines, and fixing some aspect of a crumbling house. Not hire contractors to redo the whole house, but showing people that progress can be made.
And it can be made as a joint effort.
Absolutely.
Right. Because it is something that's going to stretch across the political boundaries.
And that issue, there's a couple of issues, but certainly water in California is one of them.
We all drink water.
We all drink water. We all use it for showers. A huge part of the state uses it for their landscaping. You have the agricultural industry, the construction industry, the landscape industry. So many Californians have an interest in a stable supply of water that it breaks across demographic lines, whether that be Democrat or Republican or independent or young or old or Latino or white.
Right. So I'm sure there are going to be people that want to learn more about the book. Where can they find that kind of information?
You can go to the website dividedera.com. We actually have a book tour that starts next Saturday, about 40 dates going around, including other states. And we're going to have little forums, totally unlike this, to give an understanding. And again, the purpose of the book isn't to blame one party or another. It is to give an understanding of how these dynamics arise. If you announce tomorrow that you're going to give out 100 prizes on 100 different issues, you would find people clamoring in that particular way. That's human nature to compete for it. Well, that's what we have in government today. It's the act of you doing that causes the competition. It is not like they sit in their home and think to themselves, well, I'm going to compete tomorrow for something they didn't even know existed.
Until it's announced. So, dividedera.com?
Thedividedera.com.
Excellent. Thanks for sharing that. If you hold on for just a moment, we'll be back after a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum. Hold on for just a second.
The Conservative Forum of Silicon Valley began with 20 conservatives meeting at a restaurant in November of 2003. Our mission is to promote the principles of American liberty through education. By 2012, we had grown to over 600 paid members. Our monthly meetings feature well-known and prestigious conservative speakers addressing issues that are critical to our country's very survival. This includes speakers like Victor Davis Hanson, Andrew Breitbart, David Horowitz, and many others. In addition to our monthly meetings, we sponsor a conservative local cable access TV show, The Right Side, covering today's topics. Our Constitution discussion group not only teaches the Constitution, but started our annual essay contest that awards 2 $1,000 scholarships to local high school seniors. We are a virtual clearinghouse for grassroots organizations by providing them with table space at no charge in our exhibit area. There are typically a dozen groups represented. If you are like-minded, join us at our next meeting and become motivated and empowered. Liberty, made in America.
And welcome back to The Right Side. That was a word from our underwriters, the Conservative Forum. We appreciate tremendously the ability that we've had over the last 3.5 years or so to bring the show to you, but we couldn't have done it without the Conservative Forum's help. The news for them, though, is that they're actually known for something much bigger that they do on a regular basis. The forum presents a speaker series. And, for example, this evening, Alan West will be speaking to 300 to 500 conservatives right here in Silicon Valley, where people didn't think we even had 3. The events occur the second Tuesday of each month around 7 o'clock at the IFES Portuguese Hall in Mountain View, about 3 minutes from here, at 432 Stearland Road. And you can find out more at theconservativeforum.com about upcoming speakers such as Jim Garrity from the National Review Online. He'll be there in June. The 14th of July will be the annual barbecue for the forum. In August, Geert Wilders, who's a Dutch politician and advocate of stopping Islamization of the Netherlands, will be there, and he's quite a controversial figure. And then Kurt Schlichter, a trial lawyer and national commentator for Fox News, will be there in November. Again, you can learn more at theconservativeforum.com. In closing tonight, Tom brought up some very interesting points about the facts that, yes, we are divided, and when government gets to the size it has within our country, the skirmishes are going to be inevitable. But we've gone through periods of division before, and we've made it this far. I encourage you to learn a little bit more about that division, maybe by reviewing some of the information that he has available at his site, dividedera.com. At this point, if you can, I'd like to say thanks again for joining us this evening. And if you'd like to reach out to us, you can do so at therightsidetv@gmail.com, or we will look forward to seeing you in person or on the show sometime soon. Thanks again for joining us.